The Living Legends. Today I am interviewing two women flyers. They were married in 1952.
Miss Helen Phillips, Phillips. Mrs. Phillips was the wife.
This is Mary B. Roberts interviewing for the Oklahoma Historical Society and the Living Legends. Today I am interviewing two women flyers. I have just one most interesting tape from Mrs. Velma Woodward, and my current prospect is Mrs. Bronita Evans. Would you spell it for us, Bronita, please?
Broneta.
Evans.
Right.
She tells me she dates back to 1927, but to look at her, that doesn't seem like that could be true. I'm going to turn this over to her now. Bronita, would you tell us something about at your early years, your very early years, where you were born, when you came to Oklahoma, something about your parents, so we can identify you in the next generation?
Yes, I will. I was born at a little place that doesn't even exist now. On my birth certificate, it says Payne, Oklahoma. I don't think it exists now, but I was born on July the 13th, 1907. And I'm an Okie. And my parents moved up close to Oklahoma City, well, a little town, Minco, when I was about 5 years old. I spent the rest of my life there and until about 20 years ago, and I married.
Did you go to school in Minco?
I finished high school in Minco.
Tell us something about that school.
And I was in business in Minco, my husband and I, at that time for over 30 years.
Oh, really?
Yes.
And who was your husband?
My husband, the reason I fly, was Todd Davis.
That's it.
Yes.
Tell us something about him.
He was born in Minco. I think he was born over in Pottawatomie County, and then he moved to Minco and spent the rest of his life and his school years there. And we were married in 1927 in September. And in December of 1927, we had our first experience of owning an airplane, and we bought an old OX-5 Eagle Rock. It was an old biplane, open cockpit, wire wheels, tire. It was also air-cooled, not air-cooled, it was water-cooled. We had to, when we were barnstorming in it, I had to haul the water and the gasoline from the nearest filling station. And we strained all the gas through a chamois to get all the water out of it. And we did most of this with another couple that was flying. This other person was Dewey Mock, who's no longer living. But Dewey used to come from a little town over west of Minco and pick Todd up, and they'd drive all the way to Oklahoma City to the old airport, which was out on 29th. It is now a fire station and a park. And it was an old sod field. And they took their time. They took their flight time over there. And then...
What was the name of that early airport? What did they call it?
I just don't remember. The only thing I remember was it was just the airport on Southwest 29th. And I don't remember a name at all.
I don't remember ever having heard it.
Well, it was there a long time. But anyway, Dewey would come by and pick Clyde up and Todd up, and they would go over there and fly. And in 27, Todd bought this first Eagle Rock, and he had just soloed. And when he soloed, why, he took it up and got it down in one piece, and so he was a pilot. And we took the plane out to Minco and put it in on the farm. And we had an alfalfa field out there, and that's where we hangared it and flew it from. And we barnstormed with that. And then we bought another Eagle Rock after we sold that one to someone who wanted it to barnstorm with. And then we bought another one, and we went with Dewey and his wife on these barnstorming trips, and Mrs. Mock sold the tickets, and I hauled the gas and the water from the nearest filling station, and Todd and Dewey flew the airplane. We got $5 a ride, and we usually went the hottest days in summer, and I had long curls then, and I would stuff them up in this old helmet, and they wouldn't stay. And then when it came time to comb them, I hated flying. And we had to wear jobbers. We couldn't, of course, decently get in and out of an airplane. Yes. And a lot of people flew in it. Women took rides. And Mrs. Mock and I used to tell the boys that we thought that was the main reason they wanted to do barnstorming. But anyway, we had fun. But we'd fly over a town and do a few snap rolls and loops, and then land on the nearest cow pasture, or that time we used to cut our wheat and bind it and then thrash it. Well, we'd find a stubble field, and on those we always went, I remember, the 4th day of July every year.
Oh, yes.
And those planes would land, those old tail skids would plow up the ground, and it would be hot and dusty, and I tell you, I didn't like it then. But I did fly. Todd taught me how to fly it, and the only time I flew one of those solo was from Minco up to Enid one time. I got out of going, and the airplane he had didn't fly right, so I had to get the other one. The fellows, they had, of course, to be cranked. One of the boys at the filling station cranked it for me, and I flew it up there.
Cranked.
Yes, there was a propped.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
I
But anyway, we didn't have, and we didn't have any charts. We always flew by road map, and I still have the old Texaco road maps that we used back then. And well, flying was certainly different than it is
You
now.
flew by the highways then that
Yeah.
were marked on the road map.
That was about all there was. There was railroad tracks on there too.
I've heard of these that flew by the railroad tracks.
Iron beam, they call it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of my early day flying, and after that plane, we sold them both. Todd was always trading, and someone came along and he'd sell the plane, then he'd buy another one. And I remember after those were sold, the next thing we had that was OX5 powered was a plane that was built by a Sam Kaufman. He was an early day pilot, and he only built 5 of them, and he built them here in Oklahoma City. And we had our own OX5 engine to put in it. And I remember that the stick that you controlled it by, then we had sticks, there were wheels. And it extended from the top of the aircraft, and I never could find the ground with it. I flew it a lot, but I always bounced pretty hard every now and then. But it was enclosed, and I did like it a little better, but still it had to be propped. There was no such thing. And I remember the first airplane we had, it didn't even have a compass on it. It had a oil temperature
gauge.
and it had, there was one other gauge. I guess it was an RPM. That's the only thing I can remember. I'm sure it was because I remember now that we took off at about 35 or 40 miles an hour, and that's about the way we flew. And we landed it about the same way. It really was, you know, you just have to hand it to those old early day pilots. They didn't have anything to go by but the seat of their pants. And if they lived and flew, they had to be really good. They had to have a good feel of their aircraft. And it's something that I guess the reason that I'm still that way, I fly a lot by feel. I don't pay a lot of attention to my instruments. After I've flown a plane a while, I can tell if I'm on the right glide angle and if I'm at the right glide speed.
You must develop a kind of an inside radar in your own head, in your field.
Well, I don't know how to describe it. It's just kind of like driving a car. You know, you just do things and
You sense where the wheels are.
yes, you sense how long it's going to take you to stop when you apply the brake. It's the same thing about flying. I've always said anybody that was a good car driver can fly an airplane.
Really?
It's all a matter of coordination and good judgment. And you can walk across the highway, and if you judge a car that's too close,
Right.
and you just judge it, you might not make it.
Right.
It's the same thing. It's planning ahead and good judgment. And it's an alert. You've got to be alert. Don't do much daydreaming flying. Because you never know when it's going to be an emergency. But I've been so fortunate. I have never had a forced landing.
Really?
But we've always owned our own planes.
Uh-huh.
And this plane I'm flying now is the number 16th one.
It's 60. Where is it hanging?
I hangared at Altus. I live at Mangum now, but Altus is only a few miles. And we have a nice little strip there at Mangum, but we don't have any service there, and I can't take my plane out of the hangar, and I can't put it up. So, and then no service. So down at Altus, it's nice. They've done a lot of work down there. It's a nice airport now, and I'm very pleased to have one that close with such good service.
That's good. Tell us just a little bit now about some of these old flyers that you remember with you and your husband. And if possible, then we can get in touch with any of them. We'd like to know about it.
Well, I remember one. It was Moss Patterson, who is no longer here. And there was a Chibi Graham.
Did Moss have his airstrip out on his ranch, or?
Well, he had one down there after he went to the ranch.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he just kept his plane out this little strip out on Southwest 29th then, at that time.
First
Now, I'm talking about 1927, 8, and 9, in there. And, there's so many of those fellows, but none of them that I know are living now. You mentioned this fellow.
Mr. Harned.
Mr. Harned. And I remember him. And I remember some of the fellows like Al Williams and some of those race pilots. And, of course, I knew, who was the guy that came from down there with Will Rogers that got killed?
Wiley Post.
Wiley Post. I knew Wiley Post, I guess, even before he started flying, because he's from down in that part of the country around south of Minko. The first time I ever saw Wiley, he had the patch over his eye, and he was a quiet fella. He just kind of stood around and watched everybody fly, and I remember you could tell he wanted to fly so bad, and I know that he flew with both Mr. Mock and my husband, Todd, and or anyone that that he could ride with, and I remember that he would prop
Was he
the
just a boy
engines.
then?
Well, he was I imagine Wally was about my age. Anyway.
Really?
I think he was. And he was always good to help everybody. If you couldn't get one started, you didn't have to look for to see him. He'd be there to take his turn at that prop.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them weren't very easy to start, too.
No.
And they had such huge props. I have one of those old OX5 props, and I wonder how the engine ever turned it fast enough to get it off the ground.
With that type of engine?
With a
isn't it?
95 horsepower. I
Really is
did.
wonderful.
Mhm.
When did Wiley learn to fly?
I really don't know. I'd see him off and on, and I didn't really see much or hear much from him until he started flying for the fellow who flew around the world. He lived here in town, and he was an oil man. You remember? And the airplane was named after his daughter, Hall, Mr. Hall.
Oh,
And that was a Willie Mae, wasn't it? And that was named after his daughter. And then when he started flying, but when he learned to fly, I really don't
I
know.
thought that was Wiley's plane.
No, that belonged to Mr. Hall.
Oh, I see.
I have.
But I knew he flew the Willie Mae, and I just supposed it was his.
Mr. Hall sponsored his trip, and I think I'm not sure where he flew it, but I thought he flew it to Honolulu or to Hawaii, and I think he flew it another place or two. I just don't remember. I don't believe it was the plane that they went down in. I don't remember for sure.
Where did he meet? When did he meet Will Rogers?
You know, I just really don't know. I remember that Will came down to Chickasha, to what was then the Oklahoma College for Women. That's the first time I ever saw him on the stage and to really know who he was. And Wiley was flying him then. And he was out on the stage, and he had everybody thoroughly entertained. And Wiley kept coming out and saying, "We've got to go, we've got to go." And Will would start talking again, and he really had a time getting him away from there. And then I saw him at a lot of air shows and things after that. I saw Wiley at several air shows after that, but not as often after he got to flying Will Rogers around. I didn't see him so often.
Is there any way that anyone that you ever heard of that knew why that plane went down with Wiley and Mr. Rogers?
I really don't know.
They had never had accidents or crack-ups or even landings, as far as I know, forced landings.
I never did find out. Did you, Velma? What did you hear?
Weather, and they were lost, and they landed on that little lake to figure out where they were, and then they cracked up on the tape. Repeat that on the mic.
She told me that that it was weather and that they were lost, and they landed on this tundra, and apparently it didn't hold them up or something. It was
a pond like the other.
Yeah, it was
they landed on.
marshy.
Very rough.
And that's what happened. But I hadn't heard. I really hadn't. If I had, I'd forgotten about
Something
it.
all I had ever heard was just the newspaper on it, and they just said that they suddenly went down. Tell us something about some of the others that you encountered as you flew. Amelia Earhart, you mentioned.
No, I never did know Amelia.
Oh.
I never saw her. I wasn't fortunate enough. The girls started this 99 in back east. I think it was in Cleveland. Blanche Noyes told me.
Back when was that organized?
In 1928, in December 1928. Well, when you fly those OX-5s and the kind of aircraft that we flew at that time, you just don't get too far away from home. Going up to Wichita was a long ways to go. We went up there one time to Barnstorm, and we thought it was like when I get in my plane now to go to the West Coast or the East Coast or really go someplace, we planned for that and did everything like going around the world almost.
Right.
And it took us half a day nearly to fly up there. And,
About what was the speed of those?
Oh, about 70, 75 most of the time. And if you had, we go up because we usually we did this barnstorming mostly in the wintertime or summertime. And we always had a south wind going up, but we'd be nearly dark getting home every time. And the only forced landing we ever had with it, we had just come back from Enid on a barnstorming trip. And we were going to land at on our strip there at the farm, and we had to buzz the field to get rid of some cattle and hogs and things that was out there. It was an alfalfa field. And when we pulled up, the airplane quit. And so we had to take what was ahead of us, and it happened to be a cornfield. And it was not, it was listed, it had just been planted. Mm-hmm. And so Todd tried to land it with the rows, but the landing gear didn't quite fit in one side.
In
It
the
was in the
front.
soft part, and it nosed over with us. And this is the reason I have this old OX5 prop now. That's the prop that was on it.
The
We
one
had to
that
put
was-
a new one on it. But in those, there was always a bunch of fellows around flying, but I just can't, right at the moment, remember their names. But there was quite a few fellows that were flying or trying to get into the flying business. And then they began to have these, what they call air shows, and that was something. And I'll never forget
About when did they start?
They started in about 1927, 8,
Really?
9.
That
And yes, and you know, I'll never forget the first time I saw a Ford trimotor. I thought that thing looked like the whole outside world. It was so big, and it was made out of sheet iron. Really, it was corrugated.
sheet iron.
And I remember that soon after I saw it, they had what they called they had an air show down at Chickasha. They had a little airstrip down there, and they billed it as the Flying Man from Mars. And they'd fly over the airport at night, and they'd have it all lighted up, and they'd have, sometimes they had some kind of stuff that made it, that shot out like firecrackers, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And they'd come over the airport about 500 feet high, and what an exciting thing that was.
Well, it must have
Everybody
been
came
lovely at
out.
night,
Oh, you
of course.
couldn't stir people with a stick. Just all out there. And then they'd take people for riding, too. And I never did ride in.
Well, how about the landing at night? Did you have any help
I don't remember.
other than lighted one light at the?
They had some kind of way to get that thing down. I'm
They
sure
must
they had
have.
some lights, but I was so excited about the airplane, I'll remember. And I know it was exciting to know they flew at night. I didn't think airplanes flew at night, and I remember that's the first time I ever saw one flying at night. It was this flying man from Mars, and it was this big old trimotor job. But, flying, I've seen flying come a long ways, and it's been one of the most interesting things. I have to laugh every once in a while to myself when I'm flying along. And I know Todd did. We had flown all these hours. Now, Velma and I had flown hours and hours and hours together, and we never had a radio. We never even, we didn't, I don't guess we knew there was such a thing as radio.
You didn't miss them.
But Velma was a real good navigator. She took those charts, and she always knew right where we were. We've flown a lot of hours together without radio, and a lot of times, either if we were in her plane or in mine, we got into a little marginal weather. Sometimes without even saying a word to each other. I took the flying over, and she took the chart. She said she didn't trust my navigation, and I guess I didn't trust her flying. But we really have
Well, you
had
made
a
a wonderful-
wonderful life
You made a
together.
wonderful pair, though.
We really have, Ms. Robinson. You know, Velma has always been able to see a town at least 10 minutes before I could away. But I'm nearsighted. And when I would try to wear glasses to help me see out, and then I wanted to look down at the chart, I always had to take my glasses off and look at the chart. But we did. We made a good pair, I guess, more ways than one. And we've had some wonderful years together flying. But we flew. I remember one year Todd gave me a plane for Christmas, and the catch was that I had to go to Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, to get it. That's factory. That's Piper Factory where they had it. And it was a cruiser, a Cub cruiser, 3-place plane. And I remember that there was Velma and me, and there was Mary Frances. The three of us in the Civil Air Patrol each had a plane of our own assigned to us to fly, and we were commercial pilots then. And I remember when we went to get this 3-place plane that Todd said, "Oh my goodness, I hate to see you get a 3-place plane with 3 of you going. One of you will be wanting to go somewhere all the time." He said, "You'll be flying all the time." But I went up there and got the plane, and it was supposed to have a radio in. And when I got there, it was just before Christmas, and I wanted to get back home for Christmas, so I wouldn't wait and let them put a radio in it. I thought, well, I've flown all the time without one, so why should I have to have one? And I got in it and started home all by myself. And Velma and Mary came out the airport to see me off, and I know they were worried about how I was going to get back without Velma for navigator. But anyway, I made it all right, but I got in some very bad weather around Pittsburgh. And what they call sleet looked like little tiny hail to me, and it got on the ground and about 8 inches deep, and I spent a couple of days there trying to get off, and finally I went out the airport and the sun was shining, but it was all ice. And I went up to the tower and told the man that I wanted to come to Oklahoma, and would he help me would he let me, clear me to get off, and would he, by giving me a light, you know. Then, when without the radios, we had light signals to tell us when we were cleared to come in, or when we had to go around again, or if they wanted us to hurry up and expedite our taxiing and things like that. We went by light signals. And he kind of looked at me for a long time like he thought, I don't think you can do it. But then he said, all right. He said, you watch the tower, and when you're out there far enough and you're turned the right direction, I'll give you a green light. And he said, if I don't give you one, he said, you turn one way or the other. In other words, it didn't matter about the runway because it's all solid anyway. But he wanted me straight into the wind so I wouldn't get adrift and get a skid out of it before I got it off. And so I went out there, and luckily I got turned around the right way the first time, and he gave me a green light, and off I went. And I got to St. Louis that night, and I spent Christmas Eve in St. Louis by myself, and I was really lonely. And the next day I flew home, and I went over where I knew all the bunch would be, and they just poured out of the house when I came, and they were waving and everything. And then it's about, I guess about 60 and 70 miles from Minco down to Chickasha Airport, and that's where I was taking it. That's where we kept it. And Todd almost beat me down.
I'll bet.
But anyway, he could hardly wait. He got in the plane as soon as I got out, and we talked a little while, and he took it out. He just had to go fly it, see what it was like, and took some of the family with him.
Yeah.
But now... And then the next plane from that one, I got Val and I both had a plane just alike. We both had what we call Stinson 165 Voyagers, both red and both alike.
Oh.
So I made it nice when we were flying together. Whoever made a difference who was flying.
Yeah.
And I bought that one, and that's the first airplane we had that had a radio in it. And he gave that to me for my birthday in 1947. And he would look at all these instruments, you know, and he would laugh and say, sure doesn't look like the panel in that old OX5 shop. But he loved to fly. He really did. And in 1940, I guess, he went up for his flight physical, and they found the hypertension. We didn't know he had it. And, of course, they grounded him. And so I wouldn't go up and get my license when they asked us to come in on, I believe it was 19 and 29 or 30, see. I could have gone, and I'm sorry I didn't, but I didn't like it, and I thought that was a good way to get out of flying. I just you wouldn't believe it now, and I can't hardly believe it myself. But I thought, it was like driving a truck or something, or tractor or anything on the farm to me then. It was just a job to do that I just didn't really care a lot about because I didn't like that open air stuff, you know. But when we began to get the closed-in planes, then I began to take more interest. But I didn't go get my ticket. I could have gotten it, but I didn't. And he did. So I thought, well, that way I won't get to fly now. I won't have to fly because if I don't have an license, I'm not supposed to. And so then, of course, when he was grounded, he came home and he was really sad. And he said, if we keep flying, and we had 2 airplanes out in the hangar there on the farm then, he said, if we keep flying, somebody else in the family is going to have to get a ticket. And I was the only one else. So before I knew what was happening to me, he had me in the car, and he took me over here. And this Earl Henry that I'm telling you, that she mentioned, that I took my flight training from, he marched me up to Mr. Henry, and he introduced me, and he said, now I want you to teach her how to fly right. That's what he said, you know. In other words, he wanted me to know precision because then you turn it an airplane, you know, like those old OX5s and things. If you skidded or anything, you were like, sometimes, you know, you just couldn't do a precision.
Sometimes you could, sometimes you couldn't.
So he wanted me to know precision flying, and he wanted me to be able to take care of myself, you know, in case anything, I had an emergency.
That was after he was grounded.
So that's where I met Velma, out there at this old Knuckles Airport.
Was it?
Uh-huh.
many years have you girls been together?
Well, that's 40, and this is 77.
My goodness.
And we flew out. We'd go out there every Sunday and fly all day, just around the airport. We didn't go anywhere, but of course we were in training, you know, a lot of times, and we went out on supervised flights, even solo, but we were supervised, and then our instructors went with us, and then we learned to fly different than the people learn to fly now. The airplane I'm flying now won't spin, it's placarded against it. But then we had to do precision turns, spins. We had to do two-turn precision in, I remember on our commercial, we weren't allowed many degrees. We had to come out, you know.
10 degrees.
10 degrees on the button.
And you didn't get your
And
license, your commercial license then unless you were.
well, there's so many things that we had to do in our, we learned how to do accidental spins, or what are called over the top and out the bottom, and things that so many of the students don't get now because they don't spin. But I was talking to Hoyt Walkup, who's head of this flight school up at OSU, and he told me they put it back, and they have to learn to spin now before they can even get a private ticket. I didn't know that, but I'm certainly glad to know it, because I think it's been the cause of a lot of students spiraling in or stalling out and going in, you know, on landings and things. And
it must be a safety precaution.
Oh, you know, if a person's never been in one, and they pull the nose up and the airplane stalls and starts down, you know, it'll go like it's going to spin, but it's just a big spiral. They call it a graveyard spiral, you know. Well, if that happens to them, and they've never been in one, they don't know how to correct it or anything. And I think that has been the cause of some of our accidents you read about. And another thing I think they don't get as much groundwork as we got. When Velma and I got our private ticket, we had to take a 200 multiple choice quiz on aerodynamics, on meteorology, on navigation, and aircraft engines. We had to know something about our airplanes.
You sure did.
And the same thing. And I think they moved it up to 250, didn't they, Velma, on a commercial? We had to take a harder work, I know, on our commercial ratings. It was advanced some. It had to be more precision, more on the, you know, on the dot. And, but now...
Well, were you and Velma about the only ones that took the commercial of the women?
No, there was Mary Frances was the only other. We were the only 3 women pilots during the war that flew in CAP. Well, had commercial ratings.
Just right in this area.
In this area. But, gee, you know, Velma and I are the same age. Our birthday's in the same month.
Oh, well, you are twins then.
Hers is the 2nd and mine's the 13th of July. And when we were on every race we've flown, she always had her birthday first, and then she told me she was oldest, and I had to listen to her. But really and truly, flying is really it's altogether different, and it's just a different ball game now. It's not the same. It's just like your Model T now, and the car you're driving. It's just that advanced, and it really is that advanced. Because now, we were talking about that computerized airplane a while ago. There's now, and I don't know, but I think Narco makes the equipment, I'm not sure. But anyway, this has a deal that when she landed at the places where in our race, that there was supposed to be a clip that she could put in this plane, and the only thing she did was take it off and land it. It told her what altitude to fly for an advantage, what heading, and everything. And now that's what I'm told. I didn't see it, but the girls were talking about it in Wilmington. Well, I didn't even know about it until we got to Wilmington, and I heard them talking about it.
That wasn't much in the real competition.
No, it wasn't, because our races were, when we started, they were started with the intention of making better pilots out of women, and to make us safe pilots, and to give us experience. and let us find out what this cross-country business and to fly under rules and regulations meant, you know. Now,
Show the public women could
and show that we could be safe pilots. We had 29 races, and we did not have a fatality on any of them. We did have some accidents. We had one this year. But that girl will never stretch her gas tank again. If she could have kept it in the air another minute and a half, she'd have been on the airport. That's how close she was.
That's a shame.
Isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't stretch your
No,
gas tank.
I wouldn't try that.
No,
I don't try it with a car even.
Oh, no. It's too uncomfortable. I don't like to.
That's right.
I don't like to. I fly because I love it.
Yeah.
And I want to be, I want to enjoy it.
Yes.
And if I can enjoy it, I don't care if I fly or not. But you see, our Powder Puff Derby races are all, they're strict. They have rules and regulations
Tell us
that
something
we
about
have
the
to
rules.
abide by. Well, to begin with, you enter the race, you fill out a whole bunch of forms, and they know everything about your airplane and everything about you almost.
Mm-hmm.
And then they pay an entrance fee. And they get your forms and they look it over, and of course, most of the people know Velma and I in the race.
Is it a moneyed race? Do you?
Yeah, you get.
They pay.
Mm-hmm. But you have to be now a commercial pilot, and you have to have your co-pilot has to be at least a private pilot.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you got to be both licensed. It didn't used to be that way when we first started flying. But as rules, radio procedures, and all these things were implemented into the flying game, they felt it was better to have
Safer.
knowledgeable pilots in the plane. Some of the girls, you can fly it solo if you want to. And they have what they call the trailblazers, and they fly to the airports, make arrangements with the towers for timing and everything, and they designate these airports in time that all planes, regardless of how small it is, can make it, you know, because you can't land at any other airport on the race. You have to land at that one. You can RO in whenever you want to.
What's that?
That means to remain overnight. And you can, but you cannot fly before sun up, and you cannot fly after sundown. And those are just
And
some of the rules.
your time is kept in at each flight,
Yes.
at each leg.
When Velma and I flew the first two races, I was the pilot, and she was co-pilot the first time. The co-pilot we had to land, taxi up to the stopwatch or clock, and the co-pilot had to jump out of the plane and run over with the book and put it in there and get a stamp. That's the way we did the first two. But this one, and the several races before this one, they started being timed in the towers. And Velma and I went over to Tulsa and timed, and we put a string up in the tower, in the glass, you know. And that was our mark. When they went through there, we wanted to stand there by the clock, you know, and the minute they penetrated that, we stamped it, see, for them. And so that's the way it's done. And usually 99s go to the towers. See, the 99 organization is all over the United States. And they have chapters in all the states, many chapters in some
How
of
old
them.
is our chapter here?
Well, I really don't know, but Velma and I joined it in 1941 or 2 when they reactivated it after the war.
it was 46, honey.
Was it that
After the
late?
war, right after the war.
Well, anyway, when they reactivated it, we joined. And I think we're only about 6,
There were
7.
five.
Dorothy Morgan was the senior member. She had been a member
There
before.
were 5 of us, honey.
At
just
that
5
time.
5 of us, and we started a chapter here.
I want you to tell us something about the WASP, because I think these tapes from both of you are going to be wanted over at the Military Museum. Tell us something, whatever you can, about the WASPs.
Well, the WASP were women that learned to fly primary trainers and then go on up in flying, just like all of the boys, the men that flew in the Air Force. And they were trained to tow targets, to ferry aircraft, any kind. They had to ferry, and to do anything that they could do to keep the men pilots from having to do it and take them out of the service, you know, the fighting or whatever they were doing in regards to the war.
About when were they organized?
I'm not real sure, but I think that the war had already started, I remember, when they came to Oklahoma City to recruit. And I know I went over to be interviewed, and I had turned 35 the month before, and they wouldn't take you after you were 35. But there are 3 girls here in Oklahoma City that were members then, that went. And one of them,
Do you remember who they were?
Dottie Young, was in the very
Yeah.
first class. And Jackie Cochran had some kind of an arrangement made with the Air Force. And she started this school down at Sweetwater for these WASPs.
Mm-hmm.
And Dottie was in the very first class. And then there was Ruth Jones and Ida Carter here, who are still 99s. They're not very active in flying anymore because they don't own airplanes. And they went, and I don't remember what their class number was, but they were several down the line. And about a year ago, those girls came to our 99 meeting and brought their uniforms and a whole bunch of pictures and told us all about the way
Their
they
wax-
started. And
Their
how
wax
they-
uniform.
Yes,
Oh, that must
and
have
they
been
were hilarious, and yet it was so interesting because I would love to have been a WASP. I think they had wonderful training. These girls, Dottie, I think, flew tow. Well, I think all 3 of them told us that they flew tow planes, and they're called target planes, you know, and they actually fly an airplane that they shoot at, you know, from the
Mhm.
air. And then I think Dottie did some aircraft flying. And I know that some of the boys that I heard when they came back from war over in, across the water someplace. I can't remember where this particular place was. But anyway, they were sitting around there one Saturday afternoon, and the radio, a woman's voice came over the radio, and she was out so far, and she was landing at her ETA was at such and such a time, and everybody gathered around. They couldn't believe it, and she came flying in on one of those big spiders. What was the one that looked like I can't remember the name of it, but they were one of the fastest planes we had in the war.
PT?
No, it was
I know
it's
what
a
you
big
mean.
old plane.
Looked like
and
a
it-
bat or something.
The reason we couldn't get antifreeze was because they used them.
Mm-hmm.
And they had those big Chrysler engines in them. I can't remember the name of them. But a lot of the boys put tiger jaws on them. They
Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
P-38, are you?
no, it wasn't a P-38, honey. It was one before them. But anyway, and then she dropped in, and then 3 or 4 more dropped in after, and come to find out that they had called and said they needed these airplanes out there in an island someplace. And these girls came, said, and she taxied up in front of where they told her, you know, they told her where to go with the plane, and out comes this little old woman girl that was about 5 feet 2 or 3 tall, out of that great big airplane. And
Was she the one that they had-
that was very common for those girls to
That
take
they
those
had to put-
planes over there, and then they sent them back, you know, to get more airplanes, because they ferried a lot of our fighter planes, and some of the B-25s and the bombers, and they ferried anything that they had for them to do. They worked.
That's wonderful.
They were in the Air Force. So they've had some.
I hope we can get some
stories.
tapes from some of them that we can
Oh, I
get
wish
their
you would.
experiences in the WASP.
Those 3 girls are here in town. And
We'll see if we can't contact those. Now tell us something about your experiences, just stories. Any of them you want to?
One of my favorites.
All right. I know you've had them.
Well, there's been a lot of them. Our first trip out across the mountains, I'll never forget as long as I live, because the mountains ahead of you always look higher than you are. And you have a tendency to want to keep pulling the nose up and get just a little higher. And we had stopped at Palm Springs to spend the night. And we were flying our friends, we were flying the little blue Stinson of Irby's. We
Was
had
that
a
you
friend.
and was that you and Velma?
Velma and myself, and the lady that owned the little airplane.
Mhm.
It was smaller than the little Stinsons we owned, but
Mhm.
it was, and then we had Mary Frances with us, didn't we? There were 4 of us in it. And we stopped there to spend the night, and it was rough. It always is at Palm Springs, and we were on our way out to California to go to a WNAA meeting, weren't we?
Mm-hmm.
Women's Aeronautical. And so we taxied up to the gas pump, and here comes a little old gray-headed lady out in a flight suit to wait on us. And she walks up the airplane, and she looks in, and she sees 4 women, and her eyes just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And she was so excited that 4 women, when she found out we were from Oklahoma, and all that was just too much. She turned out to be Zeddy, what was her last name? But Zeddy learned to fly because of that. She learned to fly, and she even learned to fly twins. And at that time, she was still flying. She flew till just a while before I think she passed away. She went up to Piper's and flew that twin. But she just had a ball. They call her the flying Zeddy.
She probably had wanted to for a long time.
About the incident through the past
Yeah,
the next day. Go on.
Zeddy somebody. I can't think of Zeddy's last name. But anyway, she learned to fly, and I think she must have been close to 70 years old then. She was just excited, you know, about it. But anyway, the next day, well, soon after we landed, Blanche Noyes came in. Blanche was, for years, she's charter member 99s, and she knew all of the girls. She knew Amelia and all of them. They were real good friends. But Blanche came in, and she was flying for what was then, it wasn't FAA then.
This tape expired on the other side, and we're starting now on the second side with Mrs. Evans.
Anyway, Blanche was coming in this clip wing Waco, and just about 100 feet off the ground on her final approach, the plane did a complete turnover. She was upside down. And that shook Blanche up, but she's no veteran pilot. It didn't bother her a lot. But anyway, she came in, and she always wore a big hat. She dressed very feminine. And she had her feathers ruffled. Her hat was all lopsided, and she was pretty disgusted with the weather. But it was the winds. They were tricky. Yeah. You had to be real careful to carry a lot of power. We had already found out about that before we went out. But anyway, the next morning we took off, and I was flying. We were taking turns about flying, I think. But anyway, I was at the wheel, I remember. And incidentally, that was one of the first planes we had that had a wheel in it, wasn't it, Velma? We always had
Instead
sticks
of a stick.
before. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so we took off, and we had to circle till we almost used one full tank of gas to get through this pass, to get high enough. And so we finally got the altitude that all of us agreed was right. It was good. And so we start through the pass, and right in the middle of it, and I had just given them this song and dance act about this lovely panel that Stinson put on their aircraft, that you didn't have to divert your attention. You could change the gas without even watching, you know, and all this, and just giving them this big sales talk. And about that time, we decided we needed to change the tank. So old me, I reach over, and instead of getting the little deal that turned the gas onto the other tank, I got the ignition switch and turned off the ignition. And that was the quietest airplane for just an instant, and then 3 hands hit me right on the back. So, of course, I turned her back on immediately. I knew what I'd done. And then, of course, the big laugh was on me. You know, I'd just given him the sales talk.
Yeah, the salesman.
And then we go into, we go to the meeting. And I see Velma and Mary and Irby giggling around and talking to each other, you know. And at one of the meetings, they called me up front, and they presented me with the cutest little pair of silver dumbbells and pinned them on me and made me wear them. Then
I'm glad you didn't have any a while ago when I didn't turn the mic on.
But anyway, that was one thing that always has stuck in my mind. And of course, it's very, I can remember this day about flying over those mountains, because your first trip, if you don't learn to fly in the mountains.
Well, isn't there a very dangerous downdraft?
Yes, you have to stay so high to keep out of that, you know, above the mountain. See, they told us when we were checked out on the mountain flying thing that air flows like water.
Mhm.
It comes up the side that the wind's
Yeah.
on and then
Mhm.
comes over and drops. And you've
Mhm.
got to be above that air because you could get in one of those downdrafts.
Mhm.
And we learn what to do, you know, how to fly as best
Mhm.
we know. Of course, you never learn it all. You got to do some by experience.
Yeah.
That experience. The other time that I remember is on this trip that Velma was telling you about, going down to down to see Thad when we lost the muffler off the plane. Well, we got it fixed and we started home. And it was a day that was overcast. It wasn't a low overcast, but there was no sun out. Couldn't see the sun. And Velma, as I said, is an excellent navigator. You always ask her where you are, and she says, we're right here. That's where we are. And even to this day, with all our radio equipment and everything, we never go anywhere without taking our charts, and they're all drawn. And we use them. And I think you find most older pilots do that. They think, well, that radio just might go out, you know.
Well, I think so.
And you ought to know where you are. Well, anyway, we had flown along quite a while, and I can always tell when Velma's not really satisfied with what's going on because she has a little way of squirming around in the airplane. And I noticed that she was kind of squirming around, and I looked over at her, and she said, I said, where are we? And she said, well, I think here. Well, when she says I think, that means she's right. Where we are, but she's not real sure just exactly. So we fly along there, and she takes some. We don't have a thing to go by, no radio or anything, and there's just nothing to do but dead reckoning. We've just got to try to find something on that ground that looks like what's on the chart, you know. And finally, we found a little road or railroad track. I don't remember which, but we stayed on it until we came to a little town. We saw this this water tower sticking up, you know. And we thought we can get the name off the water tower. So we get up to this this little town, and we fly around there, and it says, Jesus saves.
Not the name of the town.
The name of the town went on there. And then we decided, well, maybe we could look at
Well, it gave you hope anyway, didn't it?
Yes, it did. we really felt it was all right, only that we did kind of look for a town name, too. And we thought we could see it on a lot of times on the depot, you know.
Yeah.
But we were down as low as we dared get, and we couldn't see it. So she decided, well, just go on, you know. And with this, something she saw just right away, she knew exactly where we were by the roads and the railroad tracks and things. She placed us on this chart. And what had happened, we'd had a wind shift, and not having radio, and of course Texas. We were in Texas when this happens, and you know, Texas doesn't have section lines like Oklahoma.
No.
If we'd been in a place where we could have said, this is due north, this is due south, and you know, then we would have had something to go by.
Of the sections, too.
But they don't have that down there. Texas is the hardest place in the United States, I think, unless it's
Like
back
flying
east.
Over like flying over the water, I think, the sea. Even in driving, I've gotten lost in Texas. One time when there was a big flood, and I couldn't see the roadway even. And I was as lost as I could be.
Well,
I'd find a pasture fence.
but this is true, and even yet, you know, of course, you're sitting up there now, and all you have to do, she turned on the race, even she turned one radio on one station and one on the other, and take the reading off and draw lines from them, you know. And she knew where they cross, that's where we are. And the DME she was talking to you is called Distance Measuring Equipment. And you punch a button, and it will tell you how far you are from the station you have tuned in. Another one will tell you what your knots how fast you're flying. And another place on it tells you what your ETA is, gives you the minutes and seconds of when you'll be there.
Oh, well, that's quite.
And so I think if I hadn't had it, I don't believe Velma would have ever lasted this year. But anyway, it was quite nice, and we had a laugh about it, of course, thinking about how we used to fly them, you know, and then. But the first race we flew, this incident, I won't forget it, I'm sure about.
Now, that was your powder puff.
Yeah, we were on Powder Puff, and we had taken off from Reading, Pennsylvania, and it ended in Springfield that year. And of course, if you don't know that country, you don't know what it's like. It's just trees, and some of the people call it mountains, but they're not. They're kind of hills. Yeah. But they'll fool you because they kind of run in straight lines, you know, and you get the illusion that they're running straight north and south, but they aren't. No. They're running this way. It's a hard country to fly over, and we had been told about it. And we were flying along, and we had our heading all picked out, and it was hazy. We were flying right into the sun. It was just hard as everything to see ahead of us. So Velma was watching down here, and finally she kept looking over like this, and then she looked over on my side, and she says, "Do you see a road on your side?" And I tilted the wing and looked down. I didn't see any road, so I tilted over on her side, and she didn't see any, and we looked ahead as far as we could see. Well, we had our heading, so we just went on, and pretty soon she looked, and there it was. Well, we just didn't think much about it. We thought maybe it got behind the trees or something, you know. And so we went on in and landed, and two of the girls drove a car up here from up there from Oklahoma. It was at the end of our race was our international convention. So we had our convention, and the final thing on the activities was a clam bake out at one of the girls. She had a glider school out there. So we left the plane on the airport there at Springfield, and we took our luggage and things, and we went with the girls, and we did a tour of the New England states. We were gone about 10 days. We had a wonderful time. But anyway, we started the trip after the clam bake that night. And we hadn't been out very long when we started on the trip. And we ran under this tunnel, and Velma and I looked at each other and laughed. And Susie Sewell was driving the car, and she saw us through the rearview mirror, and she knew that meant something, so she said, "All right, you two, tell us what you're laughing about." And so we kidded them a while, but we finally fessed up what happened to us. That road went in the tunnel, see. That's why we didn't see it. So anyway, that was another incident we had quite a laugh about, but there's dozens of them. If I could just think of all of them. We had lots of wonderful experiences. Well, when Velma was telling you about the trip down to Miami when we went on over to Cuba, that was when Batista was still in office, and he came up there and invited us. But that was a 99 meeting, too, and they did have an air show, and that's where we met Mother Earhart.
Oh, really?
She was there. And
that was Amelia's
mother.
Mm-hmm. Oh, how interesting.
And we enjoyed her. She attended another one later, but I don't remember
that
where.
That was after Amelia was.
Oh, yes, long afterwards, because this was in about 46, wasn't it, Velma, or 7 or 8. It was 8 because I had the plane then, too. However, we were in Irby's. We were in Irby's little blue plane, little blue Stinson. And she always thought, and she has passed away, and I know that up to the last day she lived, she thought Amelia was held captive, was taken captive. She always thought so.
Really?
And nothing anybody could say. And there are people who think that she might have been, but I think it's fairly well established that she wasn't, that she really went down, because there was a show. Did you see the movie?
I saw the movie.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty much the way it happened. I really do. But Mother Earhart didn't. And her sister Merle lives in Canada, and I don't know what Merle's last name is, but you know, the 99s established what we call the Amelia Earhart Scholarship from her memory. And it gives away scholarships each year to some girl in the organization. They make applications and tell what they want this money for, and it's for to make them, you know, some like a little girl might have a commercial rating and she wants to be an instructor. She wants an instructor's rating. She might want an instrument rating. She might want this to be a charter pilot.
It's for advanced work with all of them.
It's to help further
That's
their
wonderful.
aviation. And it's grown to where I served about 10 years as a permanent trustee on it, and it was interesting. But anyway, we give these scholarships at our international meetings each year, and Merle comes and presents them when she can, and she's quite nice.
That's Amelia's sister.
Yes,
Oh,
and that's the sister that's mentioned in the movie, remember? And she's, the girls who knew Amelia says that there's no, that she's quite like Amelia was, but they don't favor any. Their mannerisms and things are some like, but they don't look alike. But she's a very interesting person, and most of the English speaking people, you know, they lay us to shame. The way, you know, the language they use it perfectly, you know, they never,
yes, of course.
they don't.
I found it that way.
Velma and I were in Germany one year. Or were we in London? Where were we when the... Well, I know, but I was going to say, they say, how many speak English and how many speak American?
Right.
But that's the way it is, really and truly.
When we were in London, my husband said, of course he spoke French too, and he said, I'll sure be glad when we get out of this country and get where I can understand people. We were going to Paris next, and he couldn't understand that British accent at all.
Lots of
But
people
in France,
can't.
he got along beautifully.
Well, I think that that's true, yeah, because you really, some of those people, we've been on boat trips, things with, it is hard to understand.
Did you start to tell us something about a German experience with
About getting on this bus and having them say how many speak English and how
Oh.
many speak American. We didn't know whether to be insulted or what, but we laughed about it. But really and truly, that's the way that's it. But Velma, I just don't know of anything. Do you know of anything that we have missed that I ought to say about this?
I want you to tell her about was when they landed at Wiley.
Oh, that's right. No, I'm sorry. We left Miami and we went to Washington, D.C., and we went up that eastern seaboard, and we had to land at Wheeling to get gas in our plane. Well, at that time, it was quite an oddity to see women, you know, as many as four in the plane, and they just looked for a man, you know, to get out of the plane. They just didn't think women could fly, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, we kind of excited when they came. He walked out there to service our plane, and he looked in the plane and saw four women, and he looked at all four of us about 16 times, and then he left. And Velma says, and I guess she's right, he must have gone in to tell somebody that there's four women out there wanting gasoline.
He went in and called the newspaper reporter. And I said, we were in a hurry, we were coming all the way to Oklahoma. And I said, fill up this plane with gas. And he just kept on. And I said, what are you waiting on? And he said, I can't fill it up now. You can't go. I've called a newspaper. He says, four women in an airplane have never come in here before. I've called a newspaper to come take your picture, and you've got to wait. And we didn't get the gas until the reporter came.
That's what comes from all the big celebrities.
They just, I guess, and it was quite an experience to land on the airport, too. Gee, it's up on a mesa. And you kind of run out of airport, and you better be flying when you do.
Oh, really?
But
They
it
were
really,
just building it at that time. It's a nice airport now. They scooped these four tops off these four hills.
Yeah.
And filled them in and made an airport up there.
Oh, I see.
but we just had
Now,
one.
where was it?
Wheeling.
West
Wheeling.
Virginia.
Uh-huh. Well, I expected four women flying. Really was too much now.
And I remember we got to Washington, D.C., and of course Blanche Noyes was there. She was probably in the tower waiting for us to come in because she had gotten we had a little radio, but I don't know whether we filed a flight plan or not. Do you, Velma? I don't remember. But anyway, Velma always handles the flight plans. She files and closes all the flight plans.
You're
I
quite
don't
the
do
businessman.
anything but fly and check the plane. But, and it kind of spoils me when I'm out with someone else and Velma's along. You know, I get to look into them for things that Velma does. And of course, they don't come through like Velma.
Well, her
But,
efficiency is always
oh, that's great.
wonderful.
She's just great. But anyway, Blanche was there in the tower, and we landed in this big airport. At that time, we thought it was mammoth. And I'm sure that Blanche is the reason we got to land there. She probably went out there. And who was one of the fellows that used to early day pilot? Was it Al Williams or? Well, anyway, somebody was in the tower to see us come in, and they had us park under the wing of some big aircraft. Now, I believe it was from India. I don't remember where it was from. But anyway, we put this little Stinson kind of right under the wing of it. And we all said when we taxied in there, but the people up in the tower laughing about us in that little airplane.
They did that on purpose, probably.
And then when we got ready to go, it seems to me like didn't somebody call us that little speck down there on the airport when we were getting ready to taxi off? But anyway, they had fun and we didn't mind. And but we've had a lot of wonderful experiences. We've seen aviation grow up. And we've seen the radio, and we've seen radio come into its own with all of the sophisticated
I know
instrument panels.
Panels now look like a
well,
computerized.
It's just something that in your wildest dreams you couldn't have even imagined when we first started flying. And I remember when I got my what we call transponder, and when all I had to do was call the approach control here. I do this coming in from out Mangum, about over Minko, my hometown. I come right over. And you know what to call, 119.2 or 3, I haven't done it in so long. And they assign you a number to roll into this transponder. And then you do what they call ident. You push a little red light button, and you push it. And with that, it makes a flare on the radar screen. And from then on, you're in their control. And they tell you where to come, what heading. You give them your heading, your altitude, and your position, and tell them that your transponder equipped. Away from the airport, but when they're doing that, they're getting you out of the road of some other, out of the air, out of the way.
You can't land in.
And then they usually put you right on the downwind leg, or maybe your final approach if it's a little hazy.
It's nothing like the landing in the early days, is it?
Oh, no. No, you had to figure all that stuff out yourself. But, of course, we didn't have as many airplanes to fly in in the air as we know.
As many.
Fast planes. You see now the fast planes. By the time you see one now, it could be too late. You just have to have somebody to depend on.
The guidance from the tower, you would.
And you feel a lot more secure, but at the same time, you still want to have your neck on a swivel. You never quit looking.
Well, you think of something else, you or Velma?
I think I've talked enough.
Well, this is
but it's
the most interesting thing, and I'm sure by tomorrow I could come out and you both would have thought of lots more things to tell me.
We probably would, and
we may have to have a postscript to this one day before long.
Well, it's been fun, and of course, there's nothing I like to talk about better
Thank
than
you so much, Miss Evans. We can tell that you're quite an enthusiast, you and Velma both, and I think that you have such an enviable record, both of you, and still flying and still active with your pilot's qualifications all intact. I think that's just wonderful. Keep it up.
We do too, and we hope to. I did tell you about the Flying Farmer Organization. Do you know?
Oh, no, you didn't. No. Let's have that.
Well, in 1944, Mr. Graham, Herb Graham at OSU, it was A&M then, and Dr. Bennett and Ferdy Deering over here at the Daily Oklahoman got together, and they had heard about, well, I think Herb had met Heine Baumhoff out by Calumet. Heine was the man who built an aircraft and flew it without any instruction of any kind, only what he read out of a book. And so they decided, in talking with Heine, they found out from Heine that a whole bunch of us, farm people, had airplanes on our farm. So with Ferdy's help and Dr. Bennett's and Shawnee Brown and a bunch of people up there at what was then A&M, they invited all the flying farmers whose names they could get that had airplanes on the farm to come in as their guests. So on August the 4th, 38 of us landed out there south of Stillwater on a little old grass strip that Al Guthrie operated, a little airport out there then. And I don't remember how many planes, but there wasn't any plane larger than a two-place plane. They were all just two-place. And I remember that there were several J3 Cubs, which is tandem, you know, one in front of the other. And we went, my husband Todd and I. And so we were the 38 charter members of an organization that is now over 10,000 members. And we have over 7,000 members in Canada. And we have a nice organization down in Mexico. So we are now international.
Now that's the Flying Farmers.
The Flying Farmers. Well, then it was called Oklahoma Flying Farmers because we were the first chapter.
Mm-hmm.
So
we were the first in the United States.
Yeah, this is the home of the organization right here in Oklahoma. It sure is.
Well, I'm so glad you told me that.
And so then, of course, Ferdy put it in the Farmer Stockman, which is a paper they edit, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that went all over Texas and all over Oklahoma. And this story about these 38 flying farmers, you know, that came in. And well, of course, they started in writing to all of us, you know, trying to find out how to start a flying farmer organization in their states. So then we wrote to them and invited them to our next meeting, which we decided would be each August in Stillwater, because Dr. Bennett wanted it to be a land grant thing. You know, it's farmers, and he wanted it to always go to those colleges, you know, throughout the United States. So during that next year, though, Dr. Bennett called us in, and it was organized. I was the secretary, and we had a treasurer, and Heiner Dumoff was the first president of Oklahoma, Oklahoma Flying Farmers. So Dr. Bennett called us in, and he and Herb Graham and Ferdy, and they told us that we must make a national organization out of it, you know, and make the headquarters in Stillwater, and that's what we did. So I helped to organize the national, and I was their first secretary. And it grew. Our second meeting was tremendous. So by then, you see, we had started on this national, and we had people from all over the United States.
Now, what was it that they did?
Well, they were farmers who had airplanes, and they used them on their farm. We used ours and thought nothing of it. We hunted coyotes with it. We hunted stray cattle. We checked crop stands. We checked ponds. We checked windmills. We checked fences. But we didn't think anything about it. We had done it for a long time because it was an easy, real sure way to check your cattle.
And fast.
And they couldn't get away. You know, you could always find them. And I know we got...
Was there any crop dusting then?
No, nobody did any crop dusting then.
They didn't even have the
No, we just had these little old airplanes, and they land them on the side of hills and everything else. You know, we didn't have such a thing as a runway like we have out here. And we're all used to getting them in on a short distance and getting them out of a short distance. And but most of the planes were kept right on the farm. I know ours was. And
well, it must have been a very practical thing for the farmers for it to have grown so.
And then they started using them. I remember a group from Kiowa County come up there to the second meeting, and they had Kiowa County painted on the fuselage. Came in mass, you know. I don't know how many. And two of those people were freight people. They had freight lines, and they used those planes for that. Then there were people had, especially cattle people, who had large pastures, you know, take you all day or 2 days to ride out your pastures, check your fences, and check your cattle. And now they do it down in Texas on the King Ranch. They do it with helicopters. They've got a whole fleet of helicopters they use down there.
That's on the Key Ranch.
King, the big King
Ranch,
Ranch,
yes.
And but anyway, that's the way we grew, and now it's organized throughout. And I had a thing on the membership here just recently. That's better than 10,000 now.
Better than 10,000.
But we opened it up to associate members. We have our own insurance. We have our own headquarters, And it's in Wichita. We missed out on that. We didn't get it in Oklahoma like we thought we would. But we got so many we got outvoted because it's a Democratic organization.
Yeah.
And you can land up on the Wichita airport and taxi right up to the building. We have our own building. And the
Isn't that
insurance has housed there too.
Mm-hmm.
And we just took in the associate members. So many people wanted to belong, you know.
Why,
so
yes.
we wanted them in, but we kept it. They can't hold office. An associate member can't hold an office.
Mm-hmm.
But they can join in all the social affairs, and they can use. They have the privilege to use our insurance too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Well,
a
that's been quite
very
that's-
thriving organization.
and quite a practical thing too.
Oh, they come from everywhere. I wish you could see them when they come into the meetings. It's just
The
tremendous.
flying.
You see, it's a family organization.
Yes.
We have the teens, the Flying Farmer teens, and the Flying Farmer juniors, and they have planned programs at our meetings, our conventions, the same as the grown-ups.
Well,
And of course, many of them come for those meetings. That is their summer vacation. And so it's very interesting. And
Well,
they
that's-
just pile in the airport, and they'll just be Mama and Papa and all these children pile
but
out.
it's a learning situation too for those youngsters.
Yes, they get places they never would.
Certainly.
Like when we had the meeting
Mhm.
in New York,
Why,
in
yes.
Chicago, out in California. You see, it's passed around from state to state. This next year, it will be in August, and it'll be in Michigan, Duluth, Minnesota, Duluth. And our 99 meeting this year will be in San Francisco in August.
That'll be interesting
Hmm.
too.
Yeah.
Well, do you think of something else?
No, that's it. I'll quit. I'll sign off.
I hate to, but I guess I'll have to. This has been such a pleasant time with both of you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I appreciate your time and the enthusiastic stories that you have given us, as well as the many, many experiences that you have had. Thank you so much. This is Mary B. Roberts signing off. This is February the 7th, 1977, and I'm in the lovely apartment of Mrs. Velma Woodward. Your husband's name was
Neil.
Mrs. Neil Woodward Sr. then.
Yes.
There's also a very prominent young doctor in town now by the name of Dr. Neil Woodward Jr., their son. Mrs. Woodward is entitled by several different areas for an interview historically for our state. She's not only the wife of a very famous husband who was a wonderful doctor here that we'll hear more about, but she was also one of the early day women to take an interest in the flying, and she herself participated in the Powder Puff Derby and for a long time was a member of the women's, what is the name of the flyer club here? The women's, is it Pilot?
Well, 99s.
The 99s. I'm going to ask Ms. Woodward now to take over and to tell us something about herself and give us the name of your mother and your father, and would you spell them, please, for the genealogical people?
My father's name was Charles S. Hummel, Hummel. And my mother's name was Sadie L. Hummel.
And when did they come to Oklahoma?
My father came to Oklahoma in about 1904 or 5, and my mother came to Oklahoma in, well, either the latter part of 1905 or early 1906.
And what business was he in then?
My father came to Oklahoma as a driller on the shallow wells in the northeastern part of Oklahoma. Eventually, he worked up to a drilling contractor himself.
And that was before his medical career?
You said my
your
my
father.
father.
I see. I'm sorry. I got them
yes.
confused. That was the father. And he met your mother here again?
No, in Pennsylvania.
In Pennsylvania?
Returned to Pennsylvania and then brought her to Oklahoma, yes.
I see. She came then as a bride.
That's right.
That was pre-statehood,
Yes.
1907.
Yes.
Do you remember any of the stories or anything they told about statehood or the celebrations or?
No, not really.
That's so far back that we have to kind of get them second generation
Mhm.
now, you know. The father, your husband, was born here in Oklahoma.
No, he was born in Eldora, Iowa, and came to Oklahoma in 1900. Came to Oklahoma City in 1900.
And where did he settle here?
His parents settled here in Oklahoma City.
About what part of the city were they in?
Their first home was over on Harrison Avenue in the 300 block on Harrison Avenue, and then eventually they moved on an acreage out north of town.
Is that acreage far enough out that it is now a part of the city?
Oh yes, it's now definitely a part of the city.
Oklahoma City has spread out so till I had an idea that it was perhaps now incorporated.
Yes, that's right.
in
Has
the
been
city.
for a long time.
Do you remember something about, or has he told you something of this early home and their
Well,
how they lived and?
I don't recall a great deal of that, but I do remember Dr. Woodward saying that when he came to Oklahoma, the city, the center of town, was at Broadway and First Street, and there were just little, kind of little shack-like stores, and a number of people were living in tents, and the rest were living in pretty small houses.
Was the city well there then for the water supply?
I don't know.
Some people have described that. Do you remember the type of home that he lived in?
Yes, they had their first home was a frame house in the 300 block on Harrison Avenue. And that house was enlarged eventually and made into a 3-family unit and was only destroyed a few years ago.
Oh, too bad. And about where did you meet him? Where did you come into the picture, Velma?
I met him in Oklahoma City in 1920, the fall of 1926.
And were you in school or
I was in school at Norman.
at Norman, at OU?
Yeah, I
That's
was
where
in
you
school.
met.
No, we met in Oklahoma City. I was in school at Norman, and he was in medical school in Oklahoma City, and we met through a friend of my roommate in
I
Oklahoma
see.
City.
Was the medical school very different then to what it is now?
Oh, yes, very different.
Tell us something about that earlier.
Well, the first 2 years of the medical school at that time were down at Second and Stiles. I guess most of all 4 years of the medical school was at Second and Stiles at that time. It was before our beautiful medical school here in Oklahoma
The center
City.
that we have now. About how many buildings did they have?
One.
No hospital? Or
Well,
was it
they
all hospital?
used University Hospital, you see,
Yes.
but their
The
main
school, was it?
building, as I recall, after the boys finished their work at Norman, you see, the
Yes.
first 2 years and came to Oklahoma City, a great deal of their work was down at Second and Stiles in the clinics there.
Yes. All of their junior
And then
senior, their
university,
clinical years
and then
were
they
done.
worked, of course, at a University Hospital, but it wasn't the kind of school we have today.
No, I imagine not. You don't know about any of the professors? Do you remember the dean or?
No, not with that
Was
given.
Dr. Turley?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, was that
That's
one?
right. That's right.
I've heard him.
He was the dean, Dean Turley.
I've heard him say that he was at one time was a dean of a medical school, and it
Mhm.
must have been far
He
enough
was the
back.
dean. He was the dean of the medical school at that time.
He took quite an interest in all of the students I know and the young boys that went out into medicine. He seemed to keep up with them.
Yes.
So I think we have a tape with Dr. Turley is how I get my
Well,
information
that's
on that.
that's very fine.
When did he begin his practice?
1931.
And I believe your family consists of one boy.
That's right.
Tell us something about Dr. Neal.
He's a surgeon here. He's been practicing here now for 9 or 10 years, doing
Is he in
fine.
general surgery or?
Well, actually, his training was in general surgery, but he's doing a great deal of colon and rectal work now because
Very much like his father.
That's right.
He must have inherited some of that.
He just has a lot of equipment, a lot of very fine equipment.
Yes, that's right. And I imagine some very fine records and advice and so on. So I believe we were talking of the young Dr. Neal Woodward's now.
That's
and
right.
of his work. Whom did he marry?
A girl from Pennsylvania that he met in Chicago.
She was a nurse, I believe.
That's right.
And how many grandchildren do you have?
They have 4 children.
4.
3 boys and a girl.
And are any of them named for the doctor or
Yes,
for you?
Neil the Third.
I
Neil
had
the
no
Third.
idea. If you want to now, I'd like for you to take over and tell us something about your interest in flying, how you got started in it, and so on.
Well, as long as I can remember, as far back as I can remember, I've been interested in flying. I was terribly disappointed when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and a barnstormer came to the little town of Chelsea where I lived and was giving rides, and I just was terribly upset because I couldn't ride. It was one of the few things that my father denied me, but he took a look at it and saw some of the baling wire, etc. on it, and didn't think it was safe, so I didn't ride. But then in 1940, my husband had a couple of young men that he had taken care of their families when he first started practicing here, that had bought an interest in a little club plan aircraft. And they had finished their training and gotten their flight instructor's rating and were ready to had a contract with the military to go down in Texas as civilian flight instructors. And they very badly wanted their $300 out of that little club airplane. And they went a number of evenings to Dr. Woodward's office at closing time and tried to sell him the airplane. And one evening they said, "Now, doctor, we're about ready to go and we'd sure like to close up the deal. And if it's your wife that's preventing the deal, let us go out and talk to her because we could sell her on the idea." And he immediately protested they mustn't do that because he was sure I'd give them the money for the plane. Well, that took care of it. The next day we bought the plane, and doctor said he had to pay for my flight training in order to get me out of it long enough to let him learn to fly. And from there on, I don't think I've missed an opportunity to fly. I got my private rating that fall, actually, in November, I remember. And the next year, I got my commercial rating. And it's just one of the most fun things I can think of.
About how many years since that November?
Well, that November was 1940.
So you've really been flying then?
Quite a long while.
Quite a while. This 1977. That should rate up quite a bit of experience, I should say, and some good stories.
Well, it has brought me a good bit of experience. In 1962, 63, and 64, after Dr. Woodward was gone, I ferried New Cherokees from Florida to Oklahoma City. It was really one of the most, I guess you'd say, exciting and interesting things I could imagine having the opportunity to do. I've participated in 3...
What year was that?
I
believe you gave it.
I've participated in 3 powder puff derbies, and my friend who's flown many of the hours with me and participated in those 3 derbies is here today, and I think at this point
We're waiting to get her next.
All right.
I want to know just a little bit more about 2 or 3 things that you've mentioned.
All right.
You mentioned Chelsea. Was that
Yes.
your home?
Yes.
Do you remember the McSpaddens
Oh, sure.
there?
Sure.
Tell us something about Aunt Sally. Do you remember her?
Oh, surely I remember Aunt Sally. She was my Sunday school teacher when I was a
She was a
little
good Bible
little
student,
tyke.
wasn't she?
Yes, she was a very wonderful person.
Do you remember her husband's death?
No, I was away in boarding school at the time, and
Mhm.
I don't remember any of the details.
And you knew Paula, I guess.
Oh,
and
sure.
Mrs.
Sure.
Later, Miss Milam. I've forgotten what her name was.
Mrs. Walker Milam.
Walker Milam.
Mhm.
Uh-huh. We did a tape with her shortly before she left us. I believe that at her husband's funeral, we have a tape made by Paula in which the prayer that her mother prayed at the funeral is kept in the archives there at the Will Rogers thing. That must have been an interesting thing, but she was a devout Christian and a wonderful person as I knew her. Do you recall any of the other Rogers stories? You wouldn't remember Will.
Oh, sure.
You do?
Sure. I can remember as quite a small child when he used to come to Chelsea to visit his sisters, and they always, of course, tried to get him to, whatever was going on in town, they always made an attempt to get him to come and talk, and he came, and he always acted as if he really was embarrassed. You know, that stage manner that he had. Well, he carried that right on in his hometown, and really he did it so beautifully that I think
Most people thought
most
he really
people
was
thought
that
it
way.
was for real.
But he wasn't.
No, of course not. He was wonderful to his sisters. I can remember one Christmas a flat car was run onto the siding in Chelsea with 2 great, big, beautiful, brand new Buicks on it. It was his Christmas present to his sisters. Another Christmas I can remember.
Was that after he had visited
Well,
after
that
he
was
lived in California?
after he had become a
Uh-huh.
success, of course, in the movies.
2 new
and
Buicks.
2 brand new Buicks, and they were lots of automobile in those days.
Yes.
I can remember another Christmas morning when both of his sisters came out in beautiful seal coats that he had sent them for Christmas.
Nice.
He was wonderful to his sisters.
I remember the collie dog, beautiful dog there in Claremore that he had sent Paula. Paula had admired the collie from the Terhune kennels, and they called him Sonny. The name of the kennels, you know, the Sunnybanks kennels. And she had expressed a wish for it at some time, and here came the collie.
He had a
And
habit
the whole
of doing
town
that.
was thrilled to see that collie, and he was known everywhere, all over town. Everybody knew Sonny. The second thing I thought about, tell us just a little bit more about this ferrying. I didn't find that on my notes and clippings I looked through on you. Tell us something more about this Florida.
Well, Catlin Aviation, of course, had the distributorship here for the state. And after Dr. Woodward passed away, they asked me if I'd like to ferry some planes from Florida. They knew how much I liked to fly. Lloyd had been one of my instructors years
Lloyd,
before Catlin.
Oh, yes.
And so I was willing, and one year they told me down at the Piper plant at Vero Beach that I'd ferried more planes than any other one pilot that year. I think I'd been there, that was my 13th trip that year.
And the name of the firm was the Cherokee
Well, no, it's Piper Aircraft Company.
Piper Aircraft.
But they made the Cherokees in Vero Beach, Florida.
I
The
see.
Cherokees are one of the planes they make. They make a number of models, but the Cherokee's one
I
of
was
them.
trying to get the 5 civilized tribes mixed up in
Oh,
this.
they make, they're all represented.
I'm not very familiar with the makes of the airplane. All I know of the airlines is about my extent of it. There was did you ever know any of the celebrities like, Amelia Earhart or any of the ones in flying that
Well, I didn't.
made such a record?
I didn't know Amelia Earhart. She was a little bit before my day in flying.
Was she already
Um,
gone?
well, let's
I've
see.
forgotten my time
I
on
can't
that.
remember the date on that either.
I've
But then
forgotten when she
I knew
was
from
lost.
I knew Jackie Cochran and
Did
a
you?
number of the girls from there on down. Yes. Well, Amelia was lost at the beginning of the war, wasn't it? About 1941.
Pull that up.
Before that, it was before that.
Yeah. I can't remember just when, but it was before that.
I don't remember the date on that, but do you recall some of the others?
Jackie's still with me.
Who was your flying instructor, by the way?
Well, I had several. Lloyd Catlin was one. Earl Henry was one. Earl
Well, now
still.
that Catlin name is a very
Well, he
prominent
has
name.
Catlin. Yeah, that's right.
Can you tell us something about him? Something about them?
Well,
Describe him for us.
he was operating the Old Knuckles Airport, which was about a mile and a half east of Will Rogers Field, a little sod field, and that is where I learned to fly. And Lloyd was just my instructor part of the
A
time.
sod field.
Little sod field, you know, just
No payment.
no, And the little plane I learned to fly in, of course, that was just fine for the little sod field because it didn't have a tail wheel. It just had a tail skid. And when you landed, that tail skid dragged out the,
In the ground.
yes,
Oh.
dragged in the ground, you see. And that, actually, I don't believe that little tailcraft had any brakes. But the speed was killed out, you see, by the tail skid dragging in the ground.
How in the world could you figure the speed to land in?
Oh, that was real simple. There wasn't a great
What'd
deal
you
of...
do? Wet your finger and hold it out?
No.
How did you feel it?
You had an airspeed.
Had
Airspeed
an
indicator.
airspeed indicator, of course, but you soon learned to know when the feel of when the plane had flying speed.
Compare the takeoff and landing with that plane now with some of the ones that you've flown more recently.
Well, that little plane, it took off at, I guess, about someplace between 40 and 50 miles an hour. It got up flying speed and would leave the ground. It cruised at only 70. It was just a little 55 horsepower aircraft. And
Didn't have any starter.
no, it didn't have a battery. It didn't have a starter. Didn't have a battery. Didn't have a radio. Just had an airspeed indicator and an oil temperature gauge and, well, not much else.
No
Al-
wind
al-
indicator.
Altimeter, no.
And no way of reaching SOS call for help anywhere.
No,
No radio
no.
contact. You must have really felt all alone up there with the Creator, and that was about it. About how many hours flying do you have, Miss
Well,
Woodward?
several thousand. I haven't kept track in quite some
I'm sure
time.
she'd be too modest about it, but I couldn't estimate it.
She'll have at least better than 3,000.
Now then, we want to get to your powder puff derbies. Tell us something about the derby first. We're not familiar with the rules and the so on that and how it started. Well, all right, we'll ask her that too later. You tell us what you can about it, and then we'll get her.
Well, the Powder Puff Derby was started 29 years ago. And it, of course, was an all-woman air race.
About how many
And-
women were flying then?
Well, I really don't know, but not a great many. Bronita and I flew in the Derby in 1955. We flew again in 1957. We did have a radio in the plane. We had a low freak in the one in 55, and we had a VHF radio in the one in 57. But we didn't have the kind of equipment that we had in the Cherokee we flew in 1976.
Not as good?
Oh, there was a great deal of difference. This year, in the 1976 Derby, we had Well, just about
I think
everything you
that's
could ask
amazing.
for
I
on
think
a
that's
little
amazing
airplane.
that you people flew in the 76 Derby. I just can't get over that. And the plane you say was much.
Well, it was a much nicer plane, much faster plane, and had every kind of navigational aid practically you can think of on it, even to a DME, and had 3 radios and
My goodness.
a lot
you
of
flew in
difference.
style.
That's
Practically a
right.
jet.
That's right.
um, Tell us something about the first Derby, and then let's compare it to your last one.
Well, there were 56 planes in the first Derby. There were 200 planes entered in the last Derby, but only 199 of them took off. In most of those planes, there was a pilot and co-pilot.
Where do they fly from?
Well, it depends on where the race is set to go from. The first race was from San Diego to Springfield, Massachusetts. The race in 77 was from San Mateo, California to
Sacramento.
No, San Mateo in 57 to Philadelphia. Then the last race this year was from Sacramento, California to Wilmington, Delaware.
My, that's
But the
long.
race committee, you see, they have a committee that works really all year on that race, and they set up the race and make all the arrangement. And
Well, now how is it determined? Is it the time flying, or
it's a handicap race, and each plane has a rated speed. It's rated by the manufacturer of what the normal cruise on that plane is. And so whatever that plane averages above, if it averages a speed above that rated cruise, it's a plus score. Whatever number of miles above that is a plus score. If they have a tailwind and they lose a lot of time not navigating well, and they don't make as good speed as the plane is rated to make, then it's a minus speed and counts against their score. So a plane
so
that
it's
cruises
a time and a speed
plane that cruises 100 miles an hour has just as good a chance to be the winner as one that cruises 200
right.
miles an hour.
Mhm. Well, that is, I guess, a little more evenly matched then, isn't it? How did you rate this time? How did you come out?
Oh, I don't even remember, way down the line.
Oh, really? I'm surprised. Someone of your friends that I talked with told me that they thought that you people would have won except for one factor with one plane, the equipment on one plane.
Oh,
You know what they meant?
That girl that won, Velma. Oh, she had a computed plane.
A computed plane, that's what she said. What does that mean? What is a computed plane?
Well, it's
Well,
electronics.
just like the computers today, everything's figured out and you push the button and,
No flying to it? I mean, no,
well, practically.
no navigation. to
That's
it.
right, that's right,
Oh,
that's right.
well, that wasn't quite equivalent then to the other planes, was it? The idea was not so much the winning, I think, as it was the actually completing the
Well,
flight.
the race was organized, actually, to show that women could fly safely,
That's right.
that they could sponsor this race and participate, and not have, the idea, of course, was to do it safely. And the race has been conducted on that basis all these years. They've had very few accidents and no fatal accidents.
That's
And the
good.
few accidents they had were practically all pilot error. They ran out of gasoline.
That was the main
Right.
That was the main trouble.
The only one this year was.
Can you tell us some of the stories? I'm sure that there must have been some hectic times on these flights, especially perhaps before the planes were so well equipped. Can you tell us one or two stories, and then we'll get Ms. Evans in on this and get her to tell us one or two.
Now, are you talking about the Derby or just some of our
Any
experiences?
of them, either one. Just tell us which one it was. I know you've flown just here around in Oklahoma. I hear of you here and yonder, so I know that you've had some experiences here.
How about that first flight we took, our very first one, 35 years ago, cross country?
Well,
that sounds good. Cross country, 35 years ago.
Bronita and I went to Mississippi. My brother was in the Army, and he was in a camp down near Alexandria and was expecting to be shipped out rather shortly. And we had a little airplane at the time, but it was down for an overhaul. So Bronita took me in a little Aeronica that she owned, little Aeronica Chief. And about halfway between Alexandria and Baton Rouge, we began to notice that our feet were uncomfortably warm. About the same time, Bronita complained of a little nausea, and headache. It was her plane, and she was flying, and I was navigating. I opened we had a little window at that time that would just push back, so it didn't cause any drag to open it particularly, to open it in flight. So I opened that window and put up my chart to deflect some air through the cabin. Well, we got to Baton Rouge and landed, and my brother was there to meet us. We got out of the plane. Bronita was quite ill, but she still wanted to know what was wrong with that airplane as long as she could stand on her feet. They pulled the cowl, and the muffler fell down in many, many pieces to the ground.
That's where the gasoline is.
That's why we were hot, because the muffler had disintegrated, and the flames really were licking at the cabin wall.
That's where you got to.
And the fumes were seeping in.
Well, you landed just in time that time, didn't you?
Repairs were scarce, and we had to pay a pilot to fly down from Alexandria and bring us a used muffler and put it on to get us back to Oklahoma City.
Were you something of your feelings about that flight? Was Bronita ill?
Well,
of course, you could have taken the controls, but there was that comfort.
Well, we both were a little bit ill. There was an Army doctor there visiting with my brother when we landed, and of course he came right over and offered his assistance and suggested that we both go out to the hospital. He thought we had carbon monoxide poisoning and take some glucose solution intravenously. We declined to do that, but we did go in a cafe, and I drank 2 or 3 cups of coffee saturated with sugar and was all right. But Bronita, being on the other side from where the fresh air was coming in, had gotten more of the carbon monoxide than I had, and the sugar solution didn't do her much good because she couldn't keep it down. So she was really ill for a couple of days following that.
All right, we'll count that number 1. Now we need another one.
Didn't you and Dr. Woodward have an experience up there, come back to Chicago one time?
Well,
when you had to lay in
Dr. Woodward and
I remember you used to fly up when Neil was
during the
in
war.
Cook County.
During the war, Dr.
Hospital.
Woodward and I started to Philadelphia to a medical meeting. And we left, or should have left, Oklahoma City no later than 2 o'clock in the afternoon to make St. Louis before sundown. But at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was sitting in the car behind St. Anthony's Hospital, and he was still working. The result was that about 50 miles, maybe 75 miles south of St. Louis, it began to get really dark. And the little airplane we had, of course, had no radio equipment. So we decided, and of course no lighting equipment. So we decided that maybe we'd better pick out a spot and get down while we could see. So we picked out it was sort of a slope, but it was cleared, and near a farmhouse, and landed. A man came out to meet us and congratulated us on the spot we'd picked out. He said they'd had a lot of rain, but that hill was all right to land on because it drained real well, and that he had just gotten his cows out of it about 10 minutes before we landed, so we had picked a good spot and been fortunate that the cows had been out. And he walked all around the little airplane and seemed so more pleased to see the airplane than us. We soon, and invited us in his house to spend the night and have dinner, etc. We soon found out that he was an engineer with Curtis Wright in St. Louis. And he had this farm and drove back and forth most of the time. So we spent the night there, and the next morning I took the plane out in order to lessen the weight, and he told us a little abandoned auxiliary field where it was long enough for us to get the plane out with the luggage and Doctor and me both in. And he took Doctor and the luggage to this little strip, and we took off for Philadelphia.
You know, it's fortunate to have two that fly, isn't it? In these
Well, it does help.
things like that. Do you think of something else? I was wondering who else in the club here, who else of note flies, a woman flyer
What club?
here
99s.
in Oklahoma City.
The 99s. Well, we have lots of them.
they all?
Name some of them for us. This is the only tape we have of any woman who flies.
Oh, there's Jan, what's Jan?
Jan Million down at
She
Norman.
just got her instrument license. And
Have any of them been flying as long as you?
Well, we're among the
Old timers.
older
we're
ones.
just about the only ones left.
And you've
the
kept
first
your,
bunch.
the fact that you've kept your license up, you still put in your hours and
Well, I still
And-
have a, yes, I still have a current
still
license.
keep it active. Isn't that something? How many hours a year is that you're required?
Well, it isn't
It isn't put on that
case
anymore.
of how many hours a year.
Physical.
It's your physical, that you're physically able to fly, and then of course if you're going to exercise the privilege of a commercial pilot, you have to have made 3 landings and 3 takeoffs within the previous 60 days.
60 days. I was thinking of the Army regulations on their flying hours.
Well, no,
Mhm.
it's no required number of hours anymore,
Mhm.
except with this exception. Then you now have to take a proficiency flight test every 2 years, and you have to fly enough that you're can go out and demonstrate to an inspector that you still can do a good job of it in order to keep
Do you
a
dread
current
those?
license. No, not at all.
You never have had any problem with them?
No.
Isn't that remarkable? And you still have yours?
Yes.
Still active?
Oh, yes.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. I imagine there's not any of the others in the 99 club that have the number of years behind them that you do on the flying. Is that about right?
Not that's still flying.
I don't think so.
That's-
No.
That have kept up through the years?
There are a number of them
consistently that
have
have kept
more
it.
that have more have accumulated more hours, but I expect in length of years flying
You
in
have,
this group right
you have
here.
held your license longer than
probably.
any.
Yes.
Probably, that's true.
That's right. I'm still flying.
Do you have any plans as to the future on the flying?
No, as long as I can pass the physical and as long as I have an interest in a little airplane, and I'll probably continue to fly.
Isn't that wonderful? Do you make any trips now?
Oh yes.
Where we want to go.
Where was your last one?
My last one's to Albuquerque. I don't know. Val didn't go with me.
Can't
Where
think.
was your last one? I went down to, you went down to Frederick not too long ago.
Well, I guess Dallas has been my longest one recently, and that's not very far.
No. You just get in the air good and then you're down again. About what type plane are you flying now?
I own an interest in a Cessna 182.
Who owns the other with you?
Mr. Doherty, Phil Doherty.
Oh, I thought maybe Bronita and you owned one
No,
together.
Phil Doherty and Dr. Woodward had their first airplane together. Bought their first airplane together at the close of the war, 1945. Actually, Mr. Doherty bought the half interest in a plane that someone else owned with us.
Uh-huh.
And since that time, we've been partners on, I think, 5 airplanes.
Well, I do know. Well, that's interesting. Do you think of something else you'd like to tell us about the planes or your experiences?
No,
Uh,
I wouldn't know where to begin and where to stop.
well, don't stop. We'd love to have all you have. You have let's talk just a little bit more about Dr. Neal. He's one of my favorites. Um, his work here is in the city now.
Yes.
His office is in the city. Is it where your husband's office was?
Yes, we have a little building at 10th and Lee, and he has an office there. He also has what he calls a satellite office that he occupies one day a week at the Mercy Doctor's Tower out at Memorial.
And he does most of his surgery in Mercy.
A lot of it. He also does a lot at Baptist.
Yes. The medical profession has the father and the son many times, but we always think of the Woodwards as both of them being in the same line of work, the same type of work that the elder Dr. Woodward did, and then that Neal did, that Neal does now. I heard one of his patients about 2 weeks ago talking about Neal, and said, he's just a natural. And I said, well, he ought to be. His father was before him.
I can tell you another interesting flying experience that I remember now.
Now.
Just after the close of the war, they had an all-woman air show down in Florida. And at the all-woman air show, the Cuban government extended an invitation for any of the women that wanted to come over to Cuba as guests of the Cuban government. The only strings on it was the plane had to be flown by a woman. 4 of us from Oklahoma had gone to the air show, and we decided to go over to Havana, and we did.
A 99 meeting, though.
Had been a 99 meeting with in conjunction with the air show.
Uh-huh.
So we went to Havana, and when we got ready to leave 2 days later, the Coast Guard told us that we needed to be off the ground by 10 o'clock in the morning in order to get back across the channel before the clouds began to build up. Well, there were a couple of girls who had gone over that, for some real queer reason, had flat tires. And so here, the whole group had to go together, only they're holding us all up. And you know, in Cuba, they move very slowly. But all of a sudden, I had the bright idea with my Mae West on and all, and we didn't wear slacks to fly then. We wore dresses, so I was really quite a sight. I got out, ran across that airport to a little line boy, handed him a couple of dollar bills, and pointed at the flat tires on that plane. He went out, and he got those tires aired up and nothing flat, and we departed for the
Did you
States.
make it across the...
We made it all right, but the whole thing, I think, it was a little suspicious that those girls had the tires deflated because they wanted to remain a little longer in order to not have to pay duty when they landed back in the United States. For quite a few years, the girls had taken pictures of me running across the airport. For quite a few years, they delighted in showing me those pictures.
Well, you at least got across anyway. Well, do you think of something else, Ms. Woodward?
No, I really don't.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a most interesting interview. We appreciate you giving us the time. I believe that, let me see now. Mrs. Evans, I'm going to change the tape on the other side for you. We don't have enough to start you on here.